we go into the matter for our panel, which is sanctions and the European response. We tried now, as in the previous panel, to think out what was the idea of Putin, etc. Now we are on our own half of the field. What should we do from the West, from Europe, from the United States mainly, but also perhaps other parts of the West? We have the privilege of having Ilya Yashin, Deputy Chairman of PARNAS. PARNAS is a very important organization in Russia, one of those who really have the flag for freedom and democracy, which is more and more, as we heard, more and more difficult. That's why it's so important that we have people who really stand up. And I must say, we must appreciate from the outside. If it's easy to speak about human rights and democracy here, you can imagine how it is living in Russia. We have Gerald Knaus, who is chairman of the European Stability Initiative. He's a very energetic Austrian, really. Or you are German, or
no, it doesn't matter. Austrian.
Not Austrian. Yeah, I thought Austrian. You look so. I know him because he's been very active when it comes to promoting democracy, not least in the southeastern Europe, Turkey, other parts of that area. And one of those who I say really fighting to see that we uphold our European standards, that we just not only pretend to have them, but we actually also live up to them, which I think is very important. Ambassador Diana Janse, she is now Senior Foreign Policy Advisor at the Moderate Party, but she has a background in the Swedish Foreign Service. She goes to those places that are sometimes tough. She was our ambassador to Syria, based in Beirut. Before that to Georgia and other things. By that, now Ilya Yashin, sanctions and the European response. What is your take on this?
Okay, thank you very much. You know, it's a typical situation when I come to Europe or United States and meet with friends, with officials, with politicians. It's a typical question. What we should do with Putin and what we should do to make Russia democratic and free. It's a typical question every time, every meeting. Actually, yesterday we had a dinner with Gerald and our friends, and he asked me the same question. What do you recommend to make Russia more democratic and free? And actually, you know, it's a very good question, because I would like to ask someone too what we should do with Putin to make Russia democratic and free. And I do not think that I should make a recommends, because I believe that democratic in Russia and freedom in Russia, first of all, it is a responsibility of Russian people, not of Ukrainian people, not of European people, not of United. We should not wait that Americans or European people will come to Russia and make this work for us. Not at all. But I really grateful to those people who believe in my country and who would like to see Russia as a democratic country, and that's why I'm here. That's why actually I still live in Russia and I still keep fighting. We have many problems in Russia. We have many pressure on democratic opposition. You know, that's our friend with Olga, our colleague Boris Nemtsov. He was killed this year in February, and I believe you know all these problems. But we're still in Russia and we keep fighting just because we would like to have Russia a democratic country. But I have a number of points how to help Russia become a democratic country. First of all, maybe it sounds a little bit strange, but first of all, if you would like to help Russia, you should support Ukraine. Because if Ukraine fail, it will be the big victory of Mr. Putin. And that's why I believe all of us in Europe, in United States, in Russia, democratic part of Russia, all we should support Ukraine in this period, because in moral, with politics, in with money. Anyways, we should support Ukraine and not give a chance to Kremlin propaganda and Kremlin to win this case. Because if Ukraine fail, it will be the great victory for Mr. Putin. And from the other side, if Ukraine win, if Ukraine give us a success story, how it works, it will be very good for Russian democratic opposition, for Russian future, not only for Ukraine. And that's why I believe that all we are should support and help Ukraine in this very dramatic and very difficult situation. The second point, it's about sanctions. I know there are many discussions in Europe, and another discussion will be in December in United European about sanctions and how it works. Does it work, and should we keep sanctions, continue sanctions? So first of all, I believe that sanctions work very effective. You know, our friend Boris Nemtsov, he was a creator of this mechanism. He came to United States several years ago, and he had an idea to replace the sanctions against country to sanctions against individuals. And it was a brilliant idea, and I believe this kind of sanctions work very well, because it's very difficult to use for Putin propaganda. Individual sanctions, it's very difficult to use for Putin propaganda, much more difficult than when they use sanctions against Russia. When Nemtsov came to United States before Ukraine, before this war, before Crimea annexion, he has number of meetings with senators, with congressmen, and his idea was to replace Jackson-Vanik law to Magnitsky Act law. Remove the sanctions against country, accept sanctions against individuals. And actually, it's very important to use the correct words in Western diplomacy, in Western politics. And I believe that all of us, we should totally remove the word anti-Russian sanctions. It's not anti-Russian sanctions. It's sanctions against dictatorship. It's sanctions against the criminal officials. It's sanctions against criminal oligarchs. It's sanctions not against Russian people, not against Russia. It's not Russophobic sanctions, how Putin's propaganda trying to show it to Russian society. And it's very important for diplomats, for Western politicians, for Western officials, use the correct words, not anti-Russian sanctions. If diplomat use the words anti-Russian, he should be failed, because actually he helps to Kremlin propaganda. And actually, I believe that we should make it bigger. We should make sanctions bigger, not only against criminal officials, not against Putin's oligarchs, not only against Putin oligarchs. It should work against the Putin propaganda people. Maybe we should make it bigger. Why? I know lots of discussion in Europe, lots of discussion in United States, and we talk about anti-propaganda sanctions. Many people tell us we cannot do it because it's about freedom of speech. Because okay, we do not agree with all these propaganda guys. They tell the wrong things, but we cannot use sanctions against them because it's a freedom of speech. It's about issues. I don't think it's about issues, and I do not think it's about freedom of speech. It's about responsibility. It's about responsibility for your words, for your speeches. Okay, if you go to Russian television, and if you go on Russian television, we should turn United States into a nuclear dust, you should understand. You have a responsibility for your speech. if you would like to turn United States into a nuclear dust, you cannot have a house in United States. You cannot send your children to United States universities, and you cannot go to shopping to United States. If you say these words, you are one of the creator of atmosphere of hatred, and you should understand your responsibility. And anti-propaganda sanctions, it's a mechanism of responsibility. It's not about freedom of speech. And the third point, it's about political prisoners. I really believe that the democracy in Russia, it's a responsibility of Russian people. But I do really believe that European society, United States society, can pay more attention to Russian political prisoners. We have more than 100 political prisoners today, from left wing, from right wing, from liberal wing. Many people left Russia because of criminal cases. Many people were sent to prisons. And when Lukashenko says, "Oh, you know, I'm not the last. Now I'm not the last dictator of Europe," he's right. Actually, he's not the last, because now Lukashenko has no political prisoners, but Putin has more than 100. And I know that in Europe, here in Europe, in United States, people actually don't know about these cases, about Bolotny cases, about anti-Putin nationalists in prisons and left activists in prisons. People just don't know, and I believe you should pay more attention and support the people who left country in trying to help Russian democratic opposition here in Europe, like Zhana Nemtsova, like Olga, who organized this foundation, Boris Nemtsov Foundation, to help Russian opposition. And it's very important, but I believe that European society can pay more attention for this problem. So this is 3 very simple points I believe can work very, very well. But I just can repeat that I believe in Russia. You know, I live in Russia all my life, and I'm in politics last 15 years. I came in politics in 2000 when Putin became a president, actually. All these 15 years, and I'm 34 years old, and all my life, actually, I see Putin as a president or prime minister in government. Yes, all my life it's just Putin, 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 and I really would like to change it. I don't want to go on pension with President Putin. I would like to change something. That's why I live in Russia, and that's why I don't want to leave Russia. That's why I would like to keep fighting. That's why I and my colleagues, we trying to keep fighting. That's why we create a democratic coalition, and that's why we prepare to election for next year. We understand what Russian elections means today. We understand it very well, but we try to use it. We try to use everything. We go to rallies, we go to elections, we create this democratic coalition just to have just to give to the society the alternative. Because what they say, okay, maybe Putin is not an angel, but there is no alternative. There is no alternative. Okay, we try to create this alternative, and we would like to explain to the people that Russian democratic opposition, and it's not Russophobic, it's not pro-American or pro-Western, it's pro-Russian. It's patriotic democratic opposition. What does that mean? It means anti-corruption, it means anti-war, it means friendship with our neighbors, it means free elections. That's Russian national interests, what we try to explain to Russian society. And I believe that's very important to have the dialogue with Western countries, because if you see the Russian TV, if you read the Russian newspapers, what we see? We see the image of the enemies. Western countries, United States, European countries come the enemy. And I do not agree with this. I don't think that's our enemies here in Europe or in the United States. And it's not correct. And that's why I really believe that we should try to cooperate, and we should try to find a way how to solve the problems, not only in official ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilya. I think it was very important to get this view. We will build on that for the further discussion. Gerald, now we will listen to you.
Thanks a lot, Göran, and thanks a lot to Ilya for this presentation, which makes it very easy for me to build on the two themes that he's already described, which is the issue of individual sanctions and what Europe might do to help without exaggerating what outsiders can do, and the special crucial importance of political prisoners. I mean, what you see behind me, these two pictures from the 1970s, show us how history has come full circle. Today, we are again talking about dissidents. We're again talking about the power of the powerless. We're again talking about individuals who actually know they have no chance, but still, as Václav Havel put it in the 1970s, simply go ahead and do certain things that we feel we ought to do. We never decided that we would go to jail. We never decided to become dissidents. We just do what is decent, nothing more or less. Now, to return to the tradition of dissent, the classic tradition of the 60s and 70s, in 2015, is of course not what we expected a few years ago. Here's a nice image, and I just want you to remember this. This is from an American book by an American author. It's called The World Without Us, where he imagines what happens if human beings disappear to the center of Manhattan, and how short it takes for civilization to be overtaken by jungle. 30 hours and the subways are flooded with water. A few weeks and the pipes burst. A few years and the skyscrapers are inhabited by birds. And the point he's making is that without maintenance, everything will return back to wild nature. The same is true for our human rights institutions. And what we have neglected in the last few years with a false sense of confidence in, and perhaps a warranted but then also complacent sense of optimism with the end of the Cold War, is the maintenance. Just a quick question. When did slavery become illegal in Europe? In 1926, the League of Nations had a convention to suppress the slave trade. And in the 1930s, we had more slaves in Europe than since the days of the Roman Empire, with Stalin's Gulag and with Hitler's Nazi Germany. So we can never be complacent. The terms, the language, the institutions of human rights can always be overturned. And this is my first example and the first concrete recommendation. It concerns the premier human rights institution we have in Europe, created after the Second World War as a club of democracies, the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe today is like Dorian Gray in the novel. Still looking nice, but having sold the soul to the devil. Inner decay, but not noticed by others. Now here is where we have a parliamentary assembly, and we have governments meet, and a committee of ministers, and we have a secretariat. Let me give you two stories on political prisoners, two events that we followed closely. In 2012, Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly came together to decide whether to have a definition of a political prisoner, because there were a lot of MPs from all our European countries who said, we don't know what that is. We don't have a definition. And as a result, we can't criticize countries because we don't recognize what a political prisoner might be. In that discussion, in October 2012, some West European members of parliament proposed an amendment, and it's on the wall, and you see it here, where they actually wanted an amendment to that resolution which said that the Parliamentary Assembly confirms that defining a political prisoner is the exclusive competence of the European Court, the only authority to assess violations of fundamental rights. Essentially to say, we should be silent on fundamental rights in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. This was put to the vote. And the vote was the most dramatic in the history of the institution, 89 versus 89. So one person went out, and so this didn't pass, and the definition was adopted. So we have a definition of political prisoner adopted by the Council of Europe. The trouble is that when it was for the first time applied in January 2013, here was a resolution, it was applied to Azerbaijan. The resolution said, the Council demands Azerbaijan ensures that there are no new cases of political prisoners, refrains from prosecuting participants in demonstrations, criminalizing free speech. This was the result. 125 voted against, defeating the first application of the idea that the Council of Europe has something to say on political prisoners. 79 voted in favor. Azerbaijan then celebrated and said the Council of Europe finally is our institution. January 2013, who noticed? Now it's very interesting that this was actually the best attended assembly session voting on a resolution up to that point in the history of the assembly. So Azerbaijan was able to mobilize all of its friends, but who were these friends? All the Russians came. And now guess why all 18 Russians turned out? Because they wanted to make sure that the very first time you actually have a discussion on political prisoners, it would be clear that the autocratic bloc can defeat the democratic bloc. Here were the votes. 18 Russians all voted with Azerbaijan, all 10 Turks, all 9 Spaniards, including the man who was leading that, who is going to be the next president of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, a Spanish conservative and member of the EPP. And I can only agree with what Olaf was saying before. I think there are some serious problems with some members of the EPP when it comes to democracy and these institutions. Pedro Agramunt, to put him. Now, all the Germans and all the Swedes were on the other side, to their honor. But they were defeated. They were not as well organized. Now, you might say, who cares for votes in the Council of Europe? But then, wait a second, this is supposed to be the premier human rights organization that defends our standards, that cleanses our language, that defines our terms. In fact, it's the tip of an iceberg. The capture of the Council of Europe in recent years by autocrats that we have admitted as members on the premise that they would change and who have instead changed the institution itself is really been dramatic. But we didn't care. We neglected the maintenance. So an institution that we need now more than ever to help dissidents to defend standards has actually been turning, when it comes to human rights defense, into a jungle. This was last year, while people were actually having political trials in Russia, while the Human Rights Commissioner, Nils Muizhniek, talked about everybody that he knows in Azerbaijan being in prison. Azerbaijan had the presidency of the institution. For 6 months it presided. And here's my question. Why do we have dictatorships in this club of democracy? Why is not a single government in the Committee of Ministers putting the question in the committee whether there shouldn't be red lines to expel dictatorships? You define the red lines, and then you have a debate whether Russia and under what conditions it should remain a member. This is, according to the statutes of the Council of Europe, a club of democracies. By having them in, we confirm their propaganda. That in fact, there are different degrees and kinds of democracies, and they're not really all that bad. We are confirming the capturing of our language. In Oceania, George Orwell wrote, in 2050 we will have a new language. It's called Newspeak, where autocracy is democracy, where stolen elections, like those a few weeks ago in Baku, are free and fair elections, according to the Council of Europe delegation. You can ask why they concluded that. Where political prisoners are criminals, and where dissidents are hooligans. And we also confirm what is, I think, the worst assault, which is the idea that you can buy anything. Everything is a matter of money. The cynical argument of the new autocrats is that human rights language is a language that is not serious. You know, people don't actually believe that. You can buy former Western politicians, they will work for you. You can buy Lady Gaga to sing at the opening of the European Olympics. Imagine a world with peace while you imprison all your dissidents. And this, of course, has friends in Europe. I mean, it's been said before. Marine Le Pen, the leader of the Front National in France, is very much pro-Putin and is very much against the European Convention, as are many other parties in Europe, and as are some prime ministers of European countries. Just to evoke another member of the EPP, Viktor Orban, who's been praising the future of illiberal democracy, or rather illiberal states like Russia. Here's my first recommendation. I have two. Take back the Council of Europe, or close it down. I mean, we don't need a club of democracies that lends legitimacy to dictatorships. And here I think a Nordic initiative, or an initiative of those countries where the MPs have voted you know, Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, and others, is more than overdue. The Committee of Ministers has basically not done enough. And also the public is to blame because we don't pay any attention. The dictators do. Second institution, the European Union. The European Union also has a very forward-looking human rights policy. Here is its declaration 2012. The Human Rights Strategy and Action Plan adopted in summer 2012. The EU, and I quote, will continue to throw its full weight behind advocates of liberty, democracy, and human rights. I mean, people like Ilya and others. The human rights defenders will receive full support from the EU, and, next quote, it will use the full range of instruments, including sanctions or condemnation. And this is what Mrs. Mogherini, the High Representative, said in March this year. Human rights are not one of our priorities, they are the overarching priority. Now this is good, because right now there is a new debate in the EU. I've been listening to some of these discussions, brainstormings with think tanks on a new foreign policy strategy, on a new neighborhood policy, and I look forward to see how this full support for human rights defenders will actually look in that strategy. I think we should watch carefully, because in the debates I have been at, human rights are not mentioned very much. In fact, there is this new sense that perhaps we should retrench, we should give up, we should revoke even the Paris Declaration from 1990 that has been accepted in the framework of the CSE. A word on use of sanctions by the EU. What does the EU do now? Well, in March 2015, the EU had sanctions against people in 31 countries, including at that time 201 Belarus officials. And the goal in its own policy is to bring about a change in policy. It also had travel bans, which is a very effective way to show that certain individuals are, you know, not honorable, should be shamed. But I put here 1,200 to 1,500. That's not because we didn't do research, that's because it's extremely hard to find out. A colleague of mine spent a lot of time in Brussels, and that's part of the problem. It's actually, if you look for a website to find out which individuals cannot travel, you have to actually go through 180 different resolutions, because there isn't a coherent website where in an updated form you have information on individuals. I think this is one of the first things to change. Because if the idea is to shame, it should be easy for the press and NGOs and parliamentarians to go to a Commission website and learn who is stopped from traveling and for what violation. Otherwise, what's the public relations value? In Belarus, we tried that. We had human rights sanctions, and Ilya has already said sanctions work. Well, in Belarus they did work. They even produced effects. On a number of occasions, 2006, I can go through the whole story, 2006, 2008, 2011 after the violence in December 2010, sanctions were put against specific individuals, and if you look at the number of political prisoners, short while afterwards, sometimes it took 2 or 3 years, they were all released. So today, Belarus actually released the last bunch of well-known political prisoners in August this year. But there's the question what it means that sanctions work, and I would define it differently. It's even if the prisoners would still be in Belarus, I would say that they work. Because they have the function of a light tower. They have the function of a signal. When cynical dictators tell us that the West doesn't care about human rights, it's a cynical game, you can buy anybody, you can buy the Council of Europe, you can buy former leaders, and then institutions say, no, we actually do care, and we do identify specific individuals for specific violations. We are sending a signal about our values. We are not making life very difficult. I was just spent a few weeks in Moscow this autumn. And in Moscow, you know, you go to Pushkin Square, there's a Scandinavian restaurant next door, there is a Spanish bar next door, there is French wine everywhere. No, the supermarket is overflowing with Western products. I didn't really see the effect of the sanctions there. It's not a violation of human rights to say you can't enjoy your French wine in Paris or your coffee in Vienna. But it is a signal that there are certain things which are shameful. And unless we say what is shameful, NGOs cannot shame. But here are my concrete recommendations. First, the EU needs to communicate much better when it imposes sanctions for human rights and why. Second, the evidence is often very weak. There is a large number of people who take sanctions against individuals, including recently some Ukrainian oligarchs, to the European Court of Justice and win. There are more than 150 cases right now, and half of them are won by the individuals because the EU does not do due diligence. It doesn't actually bother to have real evidence. We need to do better than that. There are enough NGOs, if a well-structured system is set up, that can provide the evidence to make a strong case and then make it public. Here's my last two recommendations. We should set up an independent advisory commission for admission bans, for travel bans. A few countries like Sweden can fund a commission of reputed experts, former judges of human rights courts, former experts and human rights lawyers, a little commission with a little staff to which NGOs can submit proposals, and which every year, before the European Council in December, proposes a few names with the research already done. Then the Council would still agree, or have to agree by unanimity, but already the process of having a process of gathering the evidence, preparing it well, highlighting this, would help those who argue that the EU is not indifferent, and would strengthen the hand of those in the EU who think human rights should be a reason for travel bans. And this again could be perhaps a Nordic initiative. We need to take the good words back. We need to defend the meaning of democracy, free elections and political prisoner. We need to also remember the key realpolitik lesson of Helsinki, which, as you remember, Henry Kissinger at the time said about the Helsinki Agreement and the third basket, it could be written in Swahili for all he cared. It wouldn't matter. But it mattered because some people, the dissidents and others, took it seriously. It mattered because Andrei Sakharov and Václav Havel, who are today the heroes after which the human rights prizes in Europe, in the Council of Europe and in the European Parliament, are named, because they took it seriously. And in the end, it brought down an autocratic system. So this is, in fact, realpolitik. I end with this picture of the European Convention of Human Rights. It's a great document, but I think unless we defend it, the words will remain on paper. And an essay where I describe in more length what I've just been talking about, the end of shame, you'll also find on that website. So I have high hopes that Sweden, out of your own conversations, will come forward with some concrete initiatives to help dissidents and help political prisoners. Thank you.
Thank you. It's important to see the state of our own institutions. Thank you for that. You keep a mirror to us to see it. Diana, you have the floor, madam.
Thank you, Göran. Thank you. Since the previous panel was designated geopolitics, but did discuss sanctions, I will take the liberty to start off with some geopolitics, and start off with Syria, and inshallah it will all come back to sanctions and make some sense in the end. I think that we need to keep in mind that Syria is an extraordinary mess. And there are really no one single party that holds the key to a solution to the conflict in Syria. There are probably, but no one really knows, around 1,000 different groups fighting on the ground. The main ones being ISIL, the Free Syrian Army, and groups related to them. The Syrian army, the state Syrian army, supported by Hezbollah and from Lebanon and by Iranian troops. Then we have the Syrian Kurds, and then we have Al-Qaeda affiliated Al-Nusra. These are the major ones. I think if you try to add up the numbers on the groups that are non-terrorist and non-regime, we might have 10% of the boots on the ground in Syria today. And I think this is important to keep in mind, because when you speak of a solution to a conflict, it usually reflects the power balance on the ground once you push for that political solution. Since Syria is really bleeding, and I think it's the largest tragedy of our time, there is this need to find a solution, and here comes Russia, disguised for many as someone that could hold a key to this conflict. And I just want to say that don't buy that argument. I think that the simplistic view is that and you often hear it in the Swedish debate that the Security Council can't do its part because Russia is blocking anything positive coming out of the Security Council, which is perfectly true. But having said that, even the Security Council, with all due respect, a resolution from there would not have, I fear, very significant impact on what's happening on the ground. What I see Russia, since we have this need to, or this wish that we want to see an end to the conflict in Syria, and it seems plausible, or for many reasonable, that Russia holds a part of this, I will argue that Russia has completely different interests than pursuing peace in Syria. They have not entered Syria on the ground as they did in mid-September because they feel sorry for the awful situation there, and they didn't come to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people, for sure. I see instead they came to play the geopolitical game, which they're terribly good at, and they came to expose the Western countries' failed strategy in Syria, and to try to push us in order to force us to accept Russia's rules in Syria. They came to display their military capabilities, and I think we should keep in mind that Russia took everyone a bit by surprise. Even the Americans were not, didn't really see this coming. And I think what's not the most frightening is not how they managed to come in and use dumb bombs over Free Syrian Army held territories, but how they were able to build up their logistical support in the region in no time at all. It's quite a distance from Russia, and it's quite a complex military logistical situation, and they really managed to set up this base in Latakia in no time. I think they also came because they want to track Iran a bit. Iran has been on the ground for quite some time, and though Russia and Iran both support Assad, they are regional adversaries, or competing regional powers. And I think with the sanctions about to be lifted in Iran, I think there was also a will from Russia's side to make sure they could a bit monitor what was going on there and see that they weren't completely left on the back burner. And finally, obviously, they came to support Assad. As Olof mentioned earlier, the Putin regime is not a great fan of authoritarian regimes being overthrown. Though I don't think that Assad is that militarily that cornered as it's sometimes portrayed, sure, he could need a helping hand. And then finally, I will launch the thought that he also might have come in order to have the sanctions against Russia lifted in the longer run. And here I see now also how things are really playing into Russia's or Putin's hands, because we want to see a solution. We have asked for Russia to be cooperative, and once they give us a finger, we're so eager and we're so willing to interpret a lot of things that really aren't there, because we tend to see Russia through a filter of what we want Russia to be rather than what Russia actually is. And so in West, we want to see an end of the suffering in Syria, but we also want to see an end of the migration flows. And we also want to stop ISIL. And here he can sort of, he has managed quite skillfully to present himself as someone that can contribute with all this. And I just want to stress that I see a great danger in this. also with these terrible events in France, it's so obvious how, as someone pointed out, how quickly Putin has been let in from the cold and seen as a partner. If you compare the G20 meeting in Turkey with the one that was held in Australia, I think it was, in Brisbane a year ago, it was quite different. Then Putin left prematurely or departed early because I guess he didn't feel very comfortable there. And now he was a centerpiece of attention in many ways. And well, I think my point is that I think we need to be extremely careful here and not, I mean, it's so easy in order to try to see him as it's easy to try to see him as what do you call it, a savior, that he will help us with Syria. First, I don't think he can deliver, and then I think if he wants to deliver anything, it will come with a very clear price tag, and here the sanctions come in. Well, first, I heard from you, Stephen, you said that the US administration certainly is not willing to connect the two, the Syria with Ukraine. I'm not sure it will be equally easy to keep the EU coalition together in this, especially now with after Paris, with France's and others' eagerness to sort of reach out and seeing a joint enemy in ISIL. And it's true, it's a joint enemy, but your enemy's enemy is not always necessarily your friend. So I stop there.
Thank you, Diana. So now we leave it open for questions, remarks. Please, welcome. Start there, the far east or the far
Forest.
whatever it is.
Ja, jag hörs kanske ändå. Mats Johansson, former delegate to the Council of Europe for 3 years before I realized that I was put in the rotten heart of the European Union, which, according to my opinion, you mentioned Mr. Agramont. I just wanted to underline that part of the problem with all the problems you list is EPP in itself, the Conservative Club in Council of Europe. It's not a part of the solution, but a part of the problem, that they elect year after year corrupt politicians like the Spanish Conservative. Even bigger problem is, of course, the Tories, which left EPP because they were against federalism in Europe. That was the excuse for leaving the Conservative group. When I asked the Tory delegates for the real reason they voted with, joined the Russian group and voted with the Russians on many of these resolutions, they told me the truth, that they acted in the British interest of protecting the city, all the Russian money in the British banks. That was the real reason they acted the way they did. So my question, so it's even worse. The story is worse than you told it here, because you were being polite. When I raised these issues within my party, I got absolutely no support from the leadership. Mr. Reinfeldt explained it to me that we have to take the Tory problem into consideration. That's the main thing, that David Cameron has about 1/3 of his MPs are against Europe. That was the reason the Swedish moderates were not interested in doing anything real about these problems. So my question is, how should this party with a new leadership act when it comes to affecting the situation in the Council of Europe? Or should we just don't give a damn?
We wait eagerly for your answer, Gerald.
Well, I can tell you what I've been saying in Germany, in Berlin, because you have a similar question with the CDU, which also has voted on the right side on most of these issues, but has not taken a huge interest. And that is that, as we've seen later, the Tory alliance with Putin, was hugely embarrassing when Russia invaded Ukraine. Making these short-term deals, you don't actually get anything. But you then realize that when you might need this institution, we have a lot of problems in our democracies. We need a safeguard for our democracies. We need the Council of Europe to tell us whether a certain law on freedom of assembly in Hungary, or whether provisions for NGOs in Turkey, or whether we need the institution for imperfect democracies. But if it is undermined completely, it is a complete waste of money. Because if Azerbaijan is free and fair elections, if Russia civil society is in compliance with the standards, we don't use it. So if we look back at the history of dissent, the power of these concepts to inspire people, I think this is what, small groups of dissidents, political prisoners, came out of prison to take over their countries. Abad Göns, who recently died, was a Hungarian political prisoner. Václav Havel, Borislav Geremek. You look around. We actually see this is realpolitik to send a signal, and it's not very costly. You can still deal with Russia, make energy deals, talk with them over other issues, but you have an institution where you defend principles. But as you say, it's much worse than I described it. We wrote a whole report which is called Caviar Diplomacy, where we analyzed the deals in the background, the gifts, the presents, the blackmail. And here is another problem. If you allow your institutions to be undermined systematically by KGB methods, this will come back to haunt you, because you don't actually know who you can rely on. If a lot of people in these parliamentarians get gifts over many years, or are taken on many trips to various autocracies, and then are filmed in their hotel rooms, and women knock on the door, and all these stories circulate in the corridors. Everybody knows them, but nobody says anything. Then you don't know what will happen when they reach a ministry a few years later. People can be blackmailed. So I think it's also a security issue. We need to really take this more seriously. So I think I've given up on PACE. I know there are some very good people in PACE that keep fighting, but less and less, because they don't receive recognition for it. I think it's up to the governments. It's up to the Committee of Ministers. And I hope that in Sweden, Germany, other countries, the Netherlands that have traditionally cared in the past, there'll be a cross-party alliances, but I think the moderate party is in a good position to push and propose things, to say we really need to defend our values, or we are betraying the legacy of which we are otherwise justly proud. So I really hope that it is pressure that in the Committee of Ministers something happens. There's a strange rule that in the Committee of Ministers, I also think there's a problem in the Secretariat, actually. The General Secretary today, who of course was also in charge of the Nobel Peace Prize until very recently, was elected. If you look at the alliance that elected him, re-elected him, it looks pretty much like that voting alliance on political prisoners, the people who rejected the resolution, those countries. So that's also a problem. But I think it's up to member states to do something. I hope Sweden and the moderate party will take it seriously now, that we discover how far this can go. And we are losing our language. Soon we'll have torture again, and who do we appeal to? The Committee Against Torture also doesn't work very well, by the way.
Thank you. The Council of Europe, of course, was founded, 49?
Yeah.
Churchill was one of those who were driving forces on that. So it's an institution that has a long, fine story in Europe, and now is in this shape.
And Greece, when it became a dictatorship, was actually about to be expelled and left. Oh, yeah. So we have a precedent. It's not talking about expelling Russia is not expelling Russia from Europe. We can still talk in the OSCE, and it can always come back. But it is about expelling a non-democracy. I think this debate we need to start, perhaps.
Okay. More questions from the public? Yes, please.
Yeah, no. I'm Thomas Brandberg. I work at the Swedish Parliament. I have a question about Russia's involvement in the Middle East. Can Russia conduct military operations in the Middle East long term? We discussed economic problems in a couple of years, provided that the oil price stays relatively low. So how long can Russia afford to stay there? That's my question.
Who knows that? Is that you, Diana?
Well, I honestly don't know, but I do know that when the Russian budget has shrunk over the years because of sanctions, the fact that sanctions work, the military expenditures have been the least affected. But I guess, well, as I said, one theory is that they also engage now in a way to have the sanctions lifted, and once they're lifted, they can also spend more money on military than they already do, and thereby become more sustainable. But I don't know. I don't know. I think militarily they are quite. They can stay for quite some time. In terms of soldiers, it's not very demanding in terms of they don't have boots on the ground like the Iranians or Hezbollah. They discuss it, yes, and if they do, I don't think there will be in big numbers. So I guess they are quite sustainable from a military point of view, but then you have the economic side of that, which I rather not comment on.
Ilya?
You know, of course it costs money, but Putin has this money, and he will spend money for this geopolitics because it's interesting for him. Actually, it's really Putin is the leader of Russia for 15 years, and he has no alternative in Russia. He controls all the domestic politics in Russia, and it's boring. You know, it's boring, but it's really interesting to play geopolitics with Obama, with other big guys. It's interesting for him. That's why he will spend money for this. But you know, we had a statement of the Russian officials from Ministry of Defense yesterday about not only bombing Syria, but the operations, the military operation in Syria. I believe they will send the troopers. They will, because it's a part of Russian the foreign politics. It's a new reality. And we understand, and you should understand very well, why Putin did go to the Middle East. First of all, he's trying to change the agenda. You know, all these last 2 years, Putin was a bad guy, who was under critics because of Ukraine, because of Crimea, and now look at Holland, look at Obama, what they say. They say about a new coalition against the Islamic State, and Russia are welcome, Putin are welcome. For a long time, Obama didn't want to talk with Putin, but now they see, we see what we see. They sit near the table, drink coffee, and discussion about what we should do together, how to. But we should understand the very important thing about Putin politics in Syria. Does he fight the ISIL? Yes, he does. But is it the main goal of Putin to destroy ISIL? No, it is not. The main goal of Putin in Syria is to destroy the alternative to Assad regime, acceptable for Western countries. This is the first goal, because Putin trying, what is the goal of this campaign? To create the situation when Western has no alternative. From one side, it's Assad regime, from the other side, it's terrorists from Islamic State. What is this is the Putin's goal, and that's why I think the Western leaders should not trust Putin. They should not. How long it will be, I don't know. Who knows? Maybe it will end tomorrow. Maybe for years, like in Afghanistan. Who knows?
Can I add one thing?
Yes,
I think it's also important for them to have a military footprint there, even if we say that the conflict would be solved somehow. They had a previous naval base in Tartus, and was pretty much their only military installation there. But now I'm sure they're scaling up in order to stay, because it's important, and it's part of this geopolitical positioning.
Magnus, yes.
Just a matter of clarification. There was a question about what this costs. And what the Russians have in Syria today is a mixed air regiment. They make between 30 and 35 air sorties every day. According to Jane's Defense Weekly, it'll cost them, together with the Tartus space, together with the ground component, which is also there, including an air support to the Assad regime and including air defense systems, which they also support to the Assad regime, maybe $10 to $15 million a day.
10 to 50 million dollars.
$10 to $15 million a day.
Okay. Yes, please.
My name is Stig Fredriksson. I'm a journalist and a former Moscow correspondent. I have a question to Ilya Yashin about the prospects for the democratic opposition in Russia. The problem with the democratic opposition in Russia for years has been the lack of unity, that the democratic forces cannot unite. They are split, and they tend to fight each other instead of fighting Putin. So will you be able to unite in time for the September elections next year? The second question is, do you think that Mikhail Khodorkovsky in Switzerland, from his exile, will be able to help the democratic opposition in Russia?
Please, Ilya.
Thank you for your question. Another typical question. But it's correct and it's right question. You're absolutely right when you criticize Russian opposition for this fighting between each other, and it's one of the biggest problems. You're absolutely right. But we're trying to solve this problem. We're really trying. I cannot say that we have the big progress, but we're really trying. And we created a new democratic coalition. We used this coalition on these regional elections this year, and we are going to use it on the State Duma elections the next year. Navalny joined this coalition. It's based on our party, the PARNAS party, led by Mikhail Kasyanov, the former prime minister. The party was led by Boris Nemtsov, who were killed this year. We will be happy if Mikhail Khodorkovsky will join it. He helped us with the searching elections this year. He sent observers in Kostroma when I was a candidate. We have it's typical problem, traditional problem with Yabloko. It's another liberal party. It's problem for years, from 90s, from years. My party is a member of the ALDE, like Yabloko. And when we come to ALDE Congress or forums, and Yabloko come, the leader of Yabloko come to Tribune, and first he say, "Look at these guys from PARNAS. They shouldn't be here. They criminals. They bad. They guys from 90s. They shouldn't be there." It's a big problem, but I don't know how to solve it. No one knows. But if we do not talk about Jabloko, if we talk about the other parts of democratic opposition, yes, we try to be together. We try to create the mechanism of primaries, and I believe that's one of the mechanism how to solve these problems. Yes, because in this situation, the voters became as judges, and they have the right of vote. Actually, I'm not sure what will be the next year. We have 1 year to the next elections. I don't know. It's long period. In Russia, it's really long period. We don't know what will be in these years. I'm not sure I will be. I can be a candidate these years because maybe I will be a candidate. Maybe I will be in prison. Maybe something happened. I don't know. But we are preparing. About Khodorkovsky, I really respect Khodorkovsky's activities because he was in prison for 10 years. He became free and he works, he helps, but he says in public he's not a politician. He cannot be a candidate because of his criminal cases. He helps with observing on elections, in educational programs, but you should ask this question to Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He's open person. I think you can. We open for cooperation with Khodorkovsky. He's welcome, but it must be his decision.
Okay. Further questions? Yes, please.
I'm Lars Tobesson, and I would like to answer the question that Mats Johansson put to us earlier. He asked the present leadership of the party to explain its position. I can say that I speak for them. I speak for much earlier party leadership, but my explanation might go a certain way to explain what has happened. I'd like to remind you that in my days, the party was represented in the Council of Europe by party leaders, the leading persons of the parties. But when we got closer to the European Union, the party leadership decided that they should not have the time to be in the Council of Europe. They, to the extent that they busied themselves with European matters, they did that with EU questions. And to be a member of the Council of Europe became of less importance, so to say. And I can confess that I've decided to send people to the Council of Europe not because of their merits, but on the contrary. And we did this, and this was before you were elected the delegate. So
Thank you.
I'm not. No, but what I mean is that I don't think that one has really understood what this change practice has meant. And if the leadership of the party is not going to be representatives in the Council of Europe themselves, they should at least look after what is happening there so that these kinds of misadventures couldn't continue. That was not a question, it was just a remark arising out of Mr. Johansson's question.
Thank you. I think this is the case not only for the moderates in Sweden, there are also other parties and countries have arisen in the same times. The importance, so to say, of the Council of Europe seemed lessened. If we had democracy everywhere, why should you? It's not so important then to go there. That is certainly perhaps one of the reasons. What is your take on that?
Yeah, just very concretely, also a problem, for example, is that when there is a human rights vote in Germany, there's often competing votes in the Bundestag, and then the Germans don't turn up. but the Azerbaijanis or Russians make sure that all the Bulgarians, Italians, Spanish, all the people who've regularly visited over many years do turn up. So I think if national parliaments take that more seriously, make deals that both social democrats and Christian Democrats or center-right can both go and that it doesn't affect national elections. These kinds of deals in national parliaments would already make it more likely that the democratic parliaments who care about democracy can be better represented. I mean, there is this clash of just schedules, which I know in Germany is a big problem. That people say, yes, I would like to go, but I can't really because there are votes in the Bundestag. So, but you are definitely right. It's also that when MPs fight, and I've met some very impressive members who've been trying to fight against that trend, they don't receive recognition in the media. Nobody follows these debates. So perhaps one thing is to make visible what is at stake. It's that the oldest institution of human rights might be captured by autocrats and might be turned around as a fig leaf to lend legitimacy to dictatorships. I mean, I think that's the story.
Yes. Unfortunately so. Yes, please.
My name is Mats Felt. I used to work at the Foreign Office a while ago, and I went with the Foreign Secretary to St. Petersburg. So maybe I'm also one of those that might have seen Mr. Putin in an earlier apparition, before he got all those nukes on his own. I have a question concerning support for Baltic states. Pew Research make regular polls of opinion in Western Europe, and I think the most sad result recently was that if you ask Germans how many that should really stand up and fight for the Baltic countries, it was, I don't know, 30% or 20% or something like that. Is this a problem that maybe Mr. Putin is not sure about what he's going to do, but maybe he doubts very much if Western Europe, NATO, the European Union will really stand and fight for the Baltic states if he does something serious, and especially when he uses this kind of hybrid warfare which means that you don't really know when the war starts and when the real serious questions arise. Will Europe do what it should do when things get serious?
That is a $64,000 question. Who will start with that? Can start with one reflection, though. I think one of the most important things that have been done is the fact that we have American troops now on the ground in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and I guess also Romania. It's not many, but it is certainly a tripwire, meaning that if you attack, you will meet American soldiers directly. And I think that is a very important signal. That was also used during the Cold War, that you had American units stationed very close in the Fulda Gap, for example. They were immediately on the western side of the border. So if you want to make an attack, you have to kill Americans first. And that is not a good idea if you want the United States to stay out of the conflict. I think that is partly an answer to this. There are also reinforcements from Germany and Britain coming slowly, but it is. But of course, what will it mean in a really sharp situation? Of course, you perhaps have the answer, Gerald.
No answer. Just one word. I think as long as Angela Merkel is the chancellor in Germany, I think Putin will take Germany seriously, because he has realized that on things like the sanctions, Germany was. I spent a few weeks now in Russia, and one thing I heard a lot in Moscow was people were surprised by Germany. They thought, and Putin was clear, that the economic interests of German companies would make sure that Germany would not be part of the pro-sanctions front. And then it turned out that they were wrong. And a lot of Russians were really puzzled and asked, what happened? We really liked the Germans. We thought we understand them. Why are they taking such a strong position? And I think Putin understands, with Merkel there for 10 years, I mean, herself, her own background, she speaks Russian, she's from East Germany. But here's the problem. I mean, the current refugee crisis, which is what I've worked on mostly, and where I talked, again, a lot in Russia, and I then stopped talking about it because I realized these glowing eyes of people in the Kremlin think tanks. They love this crisis because it strengthens all their friends, Orban, Strache in Austria, Le Pen, all the far-right parties that are pro-Putin, anti-refugees, anti-Muslim. And it, in their hope, it weakens Angela Merkel. So I think this is an interesting thing. I don't think she's as weak as the Russians hope. I think Germany will also propose some things and will be able to, with Sweden, I hope, solve this. But at the same time, I think this is the Russian calculation. You know, if Germany would have a leader that would be as wobbly as some other bigger countries in Western Europe, these miscalculations might be more likely.
Yeah, I think you know others through yourself, and of course, when you're in Kremlin, think money is the most important. I think others also think that way, and that's up to us, of course, to see that we don't reason that way. Have you any comments on that?
Yeah, I also I want to echo what Gerald said. Words matter, and I think it's been pointed out that this is really NATO stands up for Article 5, and I think it needs to be sort of underlined. But it also matters how NATO exercises, how the NATO countries are serious about funding, about long-term equipment, etc. The whole scheme taken together, which sends an important signal. And I think it's also, when it comes to Russia, given that the sanctions do hurt, that was, I mean, it hasn't stopped Russia from doing what it did to Ukraine, but at least it sends a very strong signal that we don't agree on this. We don't accept it, we don't agree on it. And therefore I think it's so important to stick to them, because that's already a line of defense in this longer period.
Göran mentioned hastily OSCE, and I think we haven't talked about it, but I think it's a growing problem. We see in Vienna how the Russians are actually very active in trying to undermine the Helsinki treatment, and how Germans are very interested in taking up a discussion about a revival or a revision of the Helsinki Treaty. And this is done behind the screen on the diplomatic turf. And I would say that this is one of the key issues. And if it would be advisable for the Swedes and for the members of the EPP actually to raise these issues in the internal discussions, because if we are losing the Helsinki Treaty, we are back to the Yalta. And as I feel it now, I would say that we are between Yalta and Truman. Between Yalta and Kennan, I would say. And we are in a very formative phase. And the Council of Europe, important, but OSCE, I would say right now, is even more important.
Thank you for that. Any comments from the panel?
I would never argue against Ola.
Sorry. Now, to echo what you said, I mean, there was a study that came out earlier this year by the Stiftung Wissenschaft Politik, SWP in Berlin, which does reflect, I mean, these were not marginal people, these were respected German thinkers on foreign policy. And they actually did say exactly this: the OSCE should be redefining itself, it should go back to the 50s, by which they mean abandon the third basket. Sober pragmatism and focus on economic relations with Russia. And of course the Germans are preparing for the presidency of the OSCE, and there are lots of discussions in the background. On the other hand, I think this also just has to be made, you need to have a public debate. Too few people, I realize, know what the Paris Charter says, just how dramatically useful it is, how strong the language in the 1990 Paris Charter. I think just this is something, again, foundations can do. Just remind people that there is an acquis to defend.
I spent many years in the OSCE, and certainly I agree fully what has been said. I mean, the foundation of the OSCE was the third chapter, human rights, democracy. There was no OSCE before that. There was a conference, really, for disarmament. But the huge thing that was done in Helsinki 40 years ago, 1975, yes, 1975, was to put in human rights and democracy as part of the agreement, where the Soviets, of course, wanted to secure their borders and their situation. And go back on that, of course, would be a catastrophe for Europe, certainly a catastrophe for Europe. The problem, of course, is, as you mentioned several times, Gerald, is, of course, the lack of knowledge. What you are presented here, I would say, for most of us who sit here, comes as even as a surprise. We don't know it, we don't follow it, because, as you say, that there is a bit of lethargy here. We think that the principle of democracy has won, the principle of human rights is won. Why should we bother so much? And why should you fight fights when you really had this as a winning concept? In Europe, for a long time, we had this idea that we are going gradually to enlarge the area of freedom, democracy, market economy, by enlarging the Union, even including the Eastern Partnership. More difficult, but nevertheless, it should be an instrument for that. We even in the Mediterranean shaped various forms of mechanisms of cooperation. NATO has its still there. The EU certainly, even the OC has a Mediterranean forum. And again, the idea was that if you meet, if you come together, gradually the Western attractiveness would include them. Now we are in a situation which, in a way, is rather difficult. Now the problems from East and South is coming into us, the other way around. Our institutions are undermined. We see that the corruption is eating in some countries. We see that former prime ministers, two of them, one of Germany, one of Finland, as a matter of fact, on the board of Gazprom. I guess they are better off financially. But of course, it's rather sad for Europe that you have such a situation. And we don't notice that the flow of influence is going the other way, so to say. And that we have to really reshape our institutions, to learn that we need to guard them. I think that is the essence of what you said. And also in the political parties and our parliaments to take this as a serious issue. Which is difficult. It certainly is difficult, because if you don't see a problem, why should you discuss it? And that's thanks to you and your institution, of course, now is starting to see that problem. Further intervention? Yes, please.
My name is Lars Gunnar Wallin. I'm a member of the Swedish Liberal Party, who has always supported Sweden to go to NATO. I think, like Hitler tried to restore the reputation of Germany after the Second War, the same is with Putin. He liked to restore Russia or the Soviet Union all again. And you have been many 64,000 questions, and not possible. I can neither answer myself, but I just came from Tallinn. I met the Swedish ambassador there in Anders Ljunggren, and my feeling, I mean, both in Lettland and Estland, they are prepared to that Soviet Union come. It's not okay that it's not enough to be in NATO. I mean, they have been under Russian or Soviet power for 250 years. Just 50 years they have been after the first war, 22 years, and then 3 years under Nazi occupation, and now only 49 years. That's just a remark, like to Lars Tobisson, but they're not possible to answer these 64,000 questions.
So, further questions? Yes, Bo Hugemark, the author of the book.
Yeah, one comment about the response of NATO against the threat against the Baltic states. I think that it might be a little bit easier for NATO to take that step to support the Baltic states if Sweden was a NATO member, because that will be much easier to get forces to the Baltic states in that case. But a question about Ukraine. Mr. Yashin said that helping Ukraine is crucial for not letting Putin go on with his aims. So Ukraine could be threatened by in a number of ways, but ultimately with military defeat. So why deny Ukraine the means to defend herself by the arms embargo? The motive has been said that it should provoke Russia if we sent weapons, lethal weapons, to Ukraine. But isn't it so that what provokes Mr. Putin most is really if his opponents are weak?
What's your take on that, my dear panel?
Yeah, well, I agree that the language he understands is power, and that I think that's how you can contain him. So, yeah, I find it a weak argument. I agree on that.
Have you, Ilya, any comment on that? Okay. Are there further questions? So please put them now. Yes, a former ambassador to Russia.
I'm a former ambassador to Moscow. I had a few, a comment on the last thing. Perhaps I think that, on my take of Putin, unfortunately, is that he's a gambler, which to an extent would corroborate what was Bo Hugemark said, that if there is a chance, he will grab it. I'm not quite sure that he has a grand strategy, but rather that he has ideas like splitting Europe, restoring what he sees as Russian power, and keeping his keeping power. So that would be my comment on that. I have a few questions regarding Syria. Among the many good motives given for the Russian, by Diana, for the Russian intervention in Syria, is there still one more, namely that an increase of refugees, a greater increase of refugees to Europe, which will further split European unity, is at least a bonus from the Russian point of view. Lots of refugees also, by the way, come from bicycles, with bicycles over to Norway. I wonder where they got the bicycles, but that is another another question. So that, and then also on Syria, a question. It seemed to me, Diana, that you said that Putin would not be interested in any solution really, but only look for his only geopolitical interests. But isn't there, after all, also a real Russian fear, or at least concern, regarding Islamism, and then, of course, in connection with South and North Caucasus, which they see can be influenced from the conflict going on in Syria. Finally, I don't know, because I was impolite enough not to be here at the very beginning, but it would be interesting also to have a comment, if possible, from Ilya Yashin regarding the question that no one can answer, namely, how long will this last? And I'm talking about Vladimir Vladimirovich. My own take would be that he will last over 2018, which could well then be 2024, unless something dramatic happens. And what dramatic thing would that be? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Should we start with you, Ilya, about how long will Putin last?
Who knows? This question have no answer. It's a typical question, and I have a typical answer. I'm an optimist, but I have no reason for it. We see what's happening with this regime in these 15 years. From one side, it became more aggressive. And Putin do the things we didn't believe last time he can. Annexion of Crimea, war in Ukraine, it's surprise. But from the other side, from the left hand, this regime became more funny, more funny. And when I can give you example, you will understand this example. You can see the Putin's propaganda is a comedy TV channel. I will give you example about your former colleagues from the Swedish embassy. When I was 13, I had a birthday. When I became 30, when I was 30, I had a birthday. The Putin's propaganda gave me a birthday gift. It was a film on TV about me as a Swedish spy. Yeah, maybe you saw it. It was really funny. It was the best gift for my birthday. It was two arguments. The first argument, we have a proof that Yashin is a Swedish spy. It's a document. The Swedish embassy pay to Mr. Yashin for consulting and something like this. We have a document. There is no signature, but our expert has no doubt. No signatures, but it's proof. That was the first argument. The second argument, they filmed me, came to the Swedish embassy. It was a spy camera opposite the building of Swedish embassy, and they filmed how I came into. I came to have a visa with my mom, with my mother. And they told in this film, look at this, we have a record how Yashin came to Swedish embassy to have the instructions. I'm an only spy in the world who came for instructions with mother. I'm an only one spy in the world. It's really funny. It's funny, but it's interesting because it's aggressive from one side. It's really aggressive. But from the other side, it's funny. And I really believe that when the dictatorship becomes funny, that means it's not long time to live. Not for a long time.
That were optimistic words.
I try to be an optimistic.
Thank you. Thank you.
4 comments, Johan. First, whether Putin is a strategist or a tactician or a gambler. I used to think he was a gambler, but now I think he's actually both. He seems, if you connect the dots from Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, it looks more like more of a grand strategy than only throwing dice to me. I do think he takes chances, but I also think it fits into a larger strategy. Migration, sure. I think as Gerald pointed out, this serves Putin well, the migration flows to Europe. You can see that not only does it play into the hands of all his friends on fringe parties around Europe, but also it weakens Europe, and it possibly might weaken Chancellor Merkel. But I don't really see a reason for him to act on this. He can just sit back and watch it. It happens anyhow, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure it really matters if it's a bit faster or a bit slower, or I'm not sure. It's part of the top reasons. When I said, I think I said one of the reasons I laid out is to expose the West's failed strategy in Syria and to force us accept Russia's rules. And one part of that is to not have a forced resignation of Assad. And I think if you look at the Vienna talks now, what has come out of that, well, it's not negotiations really, it's talks. But the plan that came out of that is very fluffy, to put it like that, on Assad. Where will he be part of this transition period that is outlined? Will he be can he stand in the elections? It's not even mentioned, and I'm sure it will come later because Putin will not accept. He will not accept Assad being forced away, I think, and therefore I fear that these talks will have a difficult time moving forward, to put it diplomatically, because obviously this is a no-go for many others, not to say the least the Syrians that have not been part of these Vienna consultations to start with. Islamism, yes, for sure. I think there is a real concern what this can do to Russia. Northern Caucasus is bleeding jihadists to Syria, if I understand it correctly. There's a lot of people leaving to go to fight for the so-called Islamic State, and of course that will pose a security threat to Russia the way it poses a security threat for us with the returning jihadists. Is that a key concern to Putin now? Yeah, maybe. He hasn't shown any signs of trying to address the root causes to extremism in his southern neighborhood. I'm not sure he really thinks that this will do the trick.
Frank?
Göran, you mentioned the Eastern Partnership, and I think it's an important point which should be highlighted somewhat more. The Eastern Partnership was a Swedish-Polish initiative back in 2008, where we were going to intensify cooperation with the EU's 6 neighboring countries. And gradually some successes were found, and as we could expect, Russia felt provoked. This is, of course, we saw it in the terms of the disinformation which came about. The regime tried to explain that the Eastern Partnership was detrimental to Russian interests, and that they had not been invited to participate, which was all totally wrong. And I think the EU was a bit slow on the uptake before the facts were put straight. And we know that the Eastern Partnership played a role, unfortunately, in the fact of the beginning of the Ukrainian conflict. But this should not cool us down. I think it's very important that we continue highlighting these typical traditional EU peace instruments. What are we talking about? Trade, investments, aid, reforms, people-to-people, research, science, the traditional EU instruments which we know ever since the Franco-German reconciliation. And of course, Putin feels threatened because he feels that possibly flourishing neighbors with democracy, rule of law, and so forth could be looked as a very, from his angle, detrimental examples. And therefore, I feel sometimes a bit sorry that it has been so difficult inside the EU to continue to propose and the concept, including the possibility of membership, Article 49 of the EU Treaty. And I think this is something we should not be forgetting, because this could be a very important avenue also in the way we do try to use Olof's significant concept that we are somewhere between Yalta and Truman. On that road, the Eastern Partnership is a very important instrument.
Not the road to Damascus, but the road
to Brussels.
To Brussels, yes, that's right, yes. Could I say one thing about Syria? You mentioned the cost. I calculated in my head, and if you are right with your estimates of the cost of the Russian intervention in Syria, as you mentioned, it will cost, with your high estimates, about 0.5% of the Russian GDP. That's a huge cost. I mean, 0.5% of Swedish GDP is 18 billion krona. And I can tell those discussing defense budgets, 18 billion krona will be a huge hole in the Swedish defense budget. I mean, proportionally seen, it's not a bagatelle. It will have its effect, if you are right in your estimates. And maybe also that could be underestimation, because if you stay for a long time, we know that the cost from Afghanistan, for example, or Iraq for Swedes, but also for the Americans, was rather huge when you wear down the materials and you have to shift, of course, personnel. They won't stay there, the same people all the time. They have to shift it and all that. I guess I would say another thing about Syria, though, that we Europeans, if I use that about us, West Europeans, West Central, we have not done much either. I mean, we wait always for the Americans to take the initiatives, and there has been no American initiative, and thus we Europeans continue to sleep, to put it a bit not polite, but that is how we did it. It is strange, though. We have a source of instability in our neighborhood that provides terrorism and provides refugees. And we discuss how we should act in our own countries instead of saying how should we act on the source that produces all this. So in a way, as usual, we Europeans have a lot to do. And it's a bit strange, though, that we have so little debate about that. We woke up after Rwanda, and we had this responsibility to protect, saying that we cannot accept that countries are terrorized and people are killed in the hundreds of thousands, or perhaps up to 1 million. But again, 20 years later, we are doing exactly the same as Rwanda. We look the other way. Is it really our responsibility? In spite that Syria is much closer to Europe, and the refugee this time ends up with us. Go to the central station in an evening. You will be amazed how many refugees there are. The whole central station is full of refugees that are dealt with. A lot of voluntary people, but day after day or night after night. But it certainly is a shame, apart from the things you said, that we in the European Union or Europe has not been more active on our own. Because we, of course, should be able to help and support the solution. We have the financial means, we have all the instruments de facto, except will. And if you don't have a will, it doesn't matter what instruments you have. I'm sorry, but I think this is important to remember that. I get the signs there that we are running out of time,
Okay.
perhaps.
Can I comment on what Frank said?
Sure.
I couldn't agree more how important it is to keep pushing the EU cooperation with the Eastern partners, despite all the difficulties. And in this context, also saying that, referring to what Ilya said, that how we can help democratic Russia is to help Ukraine succeed. And it's a bit sad to realize that we haven't really been offering from the EU side more to this new government than we did offer Yanukovych. And despite all the difficulties now in Georgia and Moldova, not to speak of Moldova, I think we just need to keep pushing and find ways to pursue this path. And also, I think the NATO expansion agenda is also needs to be kept alive. And there I look at Stephen. And no, but mostly when it comes to Georgia, for Georgia it would mean tremendously. Well, the political will is just not there, and it's very sad to see, because it would be one political decision that would really have a huge impact.
Gerald?
Yeah, just 30 seconds to do a little advertising, because the refugee issue has been at the center of our work, and I actually think it will be hugely important, because if it continues like now, it's no longer just fringe parties, it's now governments that sit at the table in Brussels that are taking very anti-European, anti-refugee, anti-liberal and pro-Putin positions. And there are more and more, and they're on the center-right and on the center-left. So here's a little paper we wrote, the Merkel Plan, with a suggestion of what should be done. And tomorrow at 1 o'clock at the Medelhaus Museum in Fredgatan, I'll do a presentation on this, so I won't say anything now. But if you're interested, I actually think this is crucial, that there is a good initiative. It won't come from the EU, it has to be Germany, Sweden, Austria, the countries concerned, because otherwise we will see a Europe in which the forces that we need for a good Russia policy will be weak, and the forces that are in favor of the illiberalism of Putin will be strong. And that will hurt the whole Eastern neighborhood, the enlargement agenda, the relations with Turkey, and our domestic democracies.
Thank you for that. By that, there is summary and conclusions. I won't repeat now what has been said. I will just say 3 things that I think is important. First of all, and I just repeat that, as you said, Ilya, very important for Russia is that we support Ukraine, or not only Ukraine, but also Georgia, Moldova, or the countries around Russia to become better. There are a lot of things that we can do. One of the most important things that we could do is to give a European perspective, to saying to them that, yes, you have the right to be part of a European family. You are not neighbors, but you can be part of the family. That has an extremely important role, because in countries with a weak European identity, who feel unsure, this would be even enormous input. If you say that at Maidan, I can tell you, I've done it, you become the hero. That's not so important, but the important thing is for them to feel that, yes, we can be better of a better world. It's not so much about geography. It's about having a better society, and Europe represents a better society for Ukrainians, for Moldovans, for Georgians. They don't know every detail about European regulations. Thank God that they don't. But it's a better society, a less corrupt, more honest, democratic society, and a better life. I think so. That's number 1, really. And as you said, Frank Belfrage, we tried to get that from the Swedish and Polish side into the Eastern Partnership. We didn't succeed. No promises given, no door closed was a compromise. But we think we have to go back to this, about the symbolism that in reality is driving the good forces when it comes to that. Number 2 is, of course, when it comes to Russia itself, to continue with the policy that we have had and perhaps even strengthen them. You gave us some insights into that, and also proposals to that about targeting also people in the propaganda sector, if I use that, the Goebbels of Russia. There are many of them. As a former chair of the Constitutional Committee of my parliament, I can tell you there are some constitutional problems or details there. But nevertheless, I think it's important to widen the circle of sanctions, and above all, to keep it. And thirdly, or perhaps first, going back to what you said, Gerald, for us to see that we, in our own institutions, follow our own rules and don't cheat on that. In a way, that is the most worrisome. If we don't stand up for our own ideals, our own values, why should anyone else do it? why should people outside say we want to strive for Europe if we have a Europe that cheats on its own values? And that is certainly a very important thing for ourselves, not least our own political parties, our government, because that is responsible for all of us. That was cheering you up before concluding the conference. Thank you for coming. I think this was a very important issue that we discussed, and we will continue to discuss this. Thank you very much.